Wisconsin and Iowa, USA. The human mind often has fascination with things that we can't fully explain. Strange disappearances and unsolved mysteries tickle that weird itch in all of our brains that sparks our curiosity and intrigue. Some disappearances are no less than stranger than the stories of towns that also seemingly disappear off the face of the earth to never be seen again. It has seemingly happened numerous times throughout history, and we are left scratching our heads as to what took place. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we dive into an internet mystery just as much as it is a physical one. The towns of Doveland, Wisconsin, and Urkhammer, Iowa, whose existence is hotly debated on the internet on whether or not these towns were real, and into the history behind them, and whether or not these stories of disappearing American towns are pure fantasy or have some basis in reality. Today, we go over Doveland and Urkhammer, the towns that never existed. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today we dive into a topic that is one that is kind of different from something that I've ever done before. Of course, I have covered missing persons and even missing planes, but missing towns? That is something I have yet to do. And what separates the couple that I'm going to talk about today is that these towns and the existence of them seems to be rooted on the internet. And the idea of them even existing seems to be very hotly debated, with some people claiming to have merch and even t-shirts from these towns, and other sides of the aisle saying that these stories of these towns are merely hoaxes created by people on the internet. The world is littered with ghost towns, but this is a whole different thing, and maybe that these towns, that maybe, as we go into this episode, maybe they have never even existed in the first place. Hopefully this shines a light onto the human fascination with these towns that seemingly get lost to time. So how today's episode is going to work is that I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of both Doveland, Wisconsin, and Urkhammer, Iowa, talk a little bit about their backstories and whether or not these towns actually existed at some point, and then we will talk about some other examples of towns lost to time, and then we will wrap it all up at the very end with my own personal thoughts. Now, with that being said, let's start with Doveland, Wisconsin. Now, you would think that many towns would have written oral histories about them, and that information would be relatively easy to find in the grand scheme of things, and that's where you would be wrong. The only record we have of Doveland, Wisconsin would have originated from, and therefore the first mention of it to ever circulate the internet would be sometime around 2015, as that date is up for discussion. So we know the first mention of Doveland, Wisconsin was, again, mentioned in 2015. Before that, there had been no mention of a Doveland, Wisconsin, so again, keep that in the back of your mind for now. Now, the mention of Doveland would appear on a now archived question thread where the original poster of this question thread posted the following question of, quote-unquote, anyone here ever heard about Doveland, Wisconsin? Now, of course, this thread happened to be on Tumblr, and in this Tumblr thread, it goes on to describe Doveland as this town that seemingly at one point existed and is now completely off the map, with any trace of it erased from existence as well. Now, this Tumblr thread goes on to state that the town would have disappeared sometime around the late 1980s and early 1990s. At one section, this Tumblr thread reads, and I quote, "Nobody seems to remember Doveland. There was allegedly tourist memorabilia from the town that still exists, t-shirts, mugs, postcards, etc., but the town is gone. It was also removed from maps and razed from the powers that be, either to cover up what happened or out of fear that it might happen again." Close quote. However, on the surface, having a vague Tumblr post being the only evidence showing Doveland's existence obviously does not make a strong case whatsoever, as if it even existed in the first place. However, what adds fuel to the speculation fire is that many people on these message boards online have claimed that Doveland is in fact a real place, and they actually have some very vague memories of it. And in some cases, they have this memorabilia like I just mentioned, and like that Tumblr post just mentioned. Some people online have also went a step further and even posted an image from inside of what looks to be a restaurant, in which, inside this restaurant, the person who shared it said that this photograph was taken in Doveland, and it looks to be kind of like inside this restaurant or kind of this diner. And if you look up Doveland, Wisconsin, the picture will come up and you're able to see it. So you are more than welcome to go to Google and check out that photo. Although there is no way to prove that this photo was actually taken in Doveland, Wisconsin, as there aren't any identifiable objects in the picture that would point to this actually being taken in Doveland, Wisconsin. Now, there have also been people who have claimed to have had relatives that lived near Doveland, and that when visiting those said relatives, they remember hearing a local radio station claiming to be from Doveland. Again, this is all kind of hearsay, but it's very interesting, to say the least. However, another interesting tidbit in the Doveland story is from a comment made by someone on a different kind of online forum, claiming Doveland was very much real and that it no longer existed because of something else entirely. Now, this person on this basically board forum proposes a very different idea, and that being that the town was a government creation. Now, if you want to hear more, let me explain this. In this comment, the poster, Some Throwaway 7, writes, and I quote, "I think you make a good point, but Doveland was very real. My father used to mention it occasionally before he passed, and the only reason I remember it is because I found it ironic that a town named Doveland was populated almost exclusively by military personnel and their families. I will dig around for a shirt when back home early next September. If I remember correctly, the town was built as a part of Project Sanguine in the mid to late 60s. Maybe everyone left when the project was canceled, but I thought something went very wrong. You can only dig up that much turf for so long before you are bound to have problems." Close quote. Now, this statement by Some Throwaway 7 is very compelling, and if you do not know what Project Sanguine is or was, like me, I had no idea what Project Sanguine was before doing any research into this week's episode, let me give you a little history breakdown on what Project Sanguine was. Now, Project Sanguine was a military project that was conceptualized during the Cold War. It turns out that during the time period of the 1960s, the United States had no reliable ways to kind of send communications to its kind of vast fleet of nuclear submarines. And of course, these submarines could be submerged for numerous months at a time. And of course, there was a common idea that since there was no secure way, that obviously Cold War, that the Soviet Union, Russia could intercept these messages to these nuclear submarines, or that no communication could go through at all. And in the event of an emergency where these submarines might need to retaliate, they would not be able to because they would have not been able to get communication from the United States. Of course, a lack of reliable communication to your military assets and attack vessels in the event of a conflict is, of course, a big no-no. And this raised concerns. So the idea that the U.S. came up with to create some type of reliable communication to these nuclear submarines was using ELF, aka extremely low frequency. Now, these extremely low frequency waves, they are able to pass through water to reach these military submarines, and you'd have to build basically an antenna that would broadcast these extremely low frequency waves to your submarines, and so they can kind of stay confidential. However, for them to build, the U.S. military, to build an antenna to reach any sub anywhere in the world, keep that in mind, because Project Sanguine wanted to build an antenna that was big enough to broadcast to any nuclear U.S. submarine anywhere in the world. So for any antenna to be able to do that, it would have to be utterly massive. And the U.S. military would have to build and run cable underground for this antenna. So with that being said, what was the U.S. government's best idea? What they came up with was to bury 6,000 miles of underground cable, which covered a grand total of 22,500 miles, in a rectangular grid throughout the state of Wisconsin. Now, if that sounds like a lot, that's because it is. And that means that roughly 40% of Wisconsin would have buried underground cable. Now, this would involve a monumental undertaking to fully construct, and it would face a laundry list of issues pretty much from the very beginning of the project. Now, this grid of cable would then be powered by 100 underground power plants in concrete bunkers. Now, the project, which, to the surprise of absolutely no one, was slated to cost billions and billions of dollars. Project Sanguine would be fought and pass through numerous members of Congress and other similar kind of facets, and everybody kind of debated it. Is it worth spending this much money? And during this time, when the U.S. military was trying to pass Project Sanguine through the Congress and through the U.S. government, other similar projects were also proposed and developed and were deemed to be safer alternatives to Project Sanguine. And after years of kind of back and forth from the U.S. Army and the U.S. government, the project started to get a little bit off the ground, but then it would ultimately be scrapped and dropped in the 1970s. Now, Project ELF, or Project ELF, would succeed Sanguine, albeit on a much smaller scale, in the 1980s. And of course, Project ELF would also be using, of course, extremely low frequency waves, but again, on a much, much, much smaller scale and a much, much more cost-effective scale. Now, with that being said, does that mean that Doveland could have been built for the U.S. servicemen and women who were possibly working on the development of Project Sanguine? That, of course, could be a possibility. However, what makes me doubt this is that Project Sanguine is not classified. And therefore, if this town was built, why can't we find any information on it? If this is true and some sort of accident happened, like kind of these posters on the internet have kind of alluded to, and that Doveland in some way was wiped off the face of the map or completely packed up and completely closed down, we would have some sort of written record of it, of this happening, pretty much. We would have, if the U.S. servicemen and women were basically sworn to secrecy, that when they torn down Doveland, that you cannot speak about this, there must have been locals who had heard about it as well or something. We would have some type of written documentation and possibly photographs as well that just Doveland existed and that Doveland was being used basically as kind of a staging ground for Project Sanguine, and we just don't have that. And others online and those who live in Wisconsin have debated the claim that the supposed area in which Doveland existed in, which I couldn't really find in doing my research, so if other people out there have done some research into either Project Sanguine or either, Doveland, Wisconsin, if you were able to find the location in which Doveland, Wisconsin actually was, I couldn't really find that. It was kind of all very vague. The internet really, and my research didn't really tell me. If you do have that and you were able to find it, please send it my way. I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Now, those online stated, hey, Doveland is not anywhere close to the locations that the U.S. government were going to use for Project Sanguine, so there is no way that Doveland was used as a military staging area for Project Sanguine. And the idea that the government would completely erase the history of a town because of an accident went wrong seems unlikely, especially because this project wasn't classified, or from what I could find, wasn't classified. Now, like I mentioned, we would have something telling us that Doveland was there at some point in time, and if the town was flooded, for example, because of the project, we would still have that knowledge. And a lot of people have brought up the idea that, Doveland was flooded, basically to cover up the progress of Project Sanguine, or when the project got scrapped, they're like, okay, we don't need this town anymore, let's completely flood it. That still, in and of itself, doesn't make any sense, because, for example, near where I live, during the construction of a major dam on the river nearby, a town, even though it was a very small settlement, had to be completely abandoned because that area was going to be flooded because of the construction of the dam. Now, just because this very small settlement was abandoned and then flooded, there is still that history of that kind of small settlement / town to this day. So the idea that this was some type of government cover-up / kind of them flooding the town of Doveland and then completely making it up just doesn't make any sense, because we should have some type of written documentation that Doveland, Wisconsin at some point in time existed, and we just don't. And we don't have any evidence that there was any flooding that did that. Obviously, there is dams in Wisconsin, of course, but there is no evidence, again, that showed them flooding a town for some unknown reason. That just does not exist. There is no written documentation of anything like that. And again, that makes me doubt Doveland's existence entirely. Other theories out there have been proposed that perhaps a large earthquake could have destroyed the town of Doveland beyond repair. However, that seems very unlikely, as the largest recorded earthquake in Wisconsin was somewhere around in kind of like the 5s on the Richter scale, and that is not nearly powerful enough to level a town completely to the ground. And of course, Wisconsin doesn't get that very often or at all, so that doesn't make much sense either. Now, some theories have also been thrown out that the idea that the town is invisible. And to be honest with you, I'm not even going to dive into that theory because that sounds like something straight out of a Stephen King book rather than actual fact. Now, to me, there just isn't any information to show that the town of Doveland, Wisconsin actually exists in the first place or ever did exist. Perhaps this is just an internet hoax that has been kept alive through numerous different voices across the internet. It's kind of like a giant game of telephone with numerous people putting in their own little tidbits of the story to make it sound more and more interesting. Now, I want to believe it, but I just can't. And that kind of leads us into the second town I want to discuss today as well, because this one shares similar characteristics in terms of the story of the town's origin, but is kind of very different from Doveland, Wisconsin, because it seems to be there's more of a story that exists with Urkhammer, Iowa. Now, Urkhammer, Iowa was supposedly a town situated along Route 41 in Iowa, and like many small towns in the Midwest during the early 1900s, there was really nothing setting this town apart from much of the rest. It kind of blended in with all the other little small towns that were littered across the Midwest during this time period. However, two supposed stories of the town hit newspapers in 1929 and later in 1932, telling stories about this town and how it was found abandoned. In 1929, the Clarion Sun-Telegraph out of Davenport, Iowa, reported that a plane had flew over the town of Urkhammer and saw that the town looked to be a maze of unattended homes and fields. And in some accounts of this story, these spaces that were supposed to have houses and streets, they just weren't there. Now, the story continues and says that it was just kind of these endless fields in this town, where the town was supposed to be, and there was no buildings, there was no streets, it was just empty. However, as the legend goes, this story was picked up by many mainstream newspapers about the disappearing town of Urkhammer, but unfortunately, the story did not get that much press in mainstream media during this time, as the Wall Street crash of 1929 was taking place at almost the exact same time, so that dominated the headlines. Now, later in 1932, a caravan of farming families from Illinois were traveling towards California and decided to make a pit stop in the town of Urkhammer. Now, they made camp near the outskirts of the town, and that night the families of the caravan pooled what money they had together at the time and decided that they should send a couple of men from the group to check out the town and the general store. Seems normal so far. Now, when the men arrived at the town, it kind of seemed totally normal until they tried to walk up the front steps of the general store. Now, when the men approached the general store and they tried to walk up the front steps into the building, their feet passed straight through the boards of the steps and onto the ground below. Almost like the steps of the building weren't there in the first place. Now, this of course mystified the men, who on closer examination realized the whole building of the general store was like this. It looked real, but it wasn't. Like it was a mirage that was kind of fading out of existence entirely. Now, the men picked up another nearby loose board and tried to place it on the steps as an attempt to walk up them, and when they tried that, their feet also passed straight through. Now, the men quickly rushed back to the caravan to repeat the oddities that were kind of occurring in Urkhammer to the rest of this kind of caravan. And when they arrived back and they relayed this kind of unbelievable story to the other members of the camp, they, of course, did not believe them. They're like, this is no way, you're making this up, this does not make any sense, you're drunk, whatever. And the members of the camp actually changed their opinions pretty quickly when they realized that the men didn't spend all that money that they were given on booze, and that these men were actually completely sober. Because initially, again, they thought that they were drunk. They thought they went into the general store, grabbed all this booze, and are spinning a yarn about how the general store doesn't exist. But they were completely sober, and they still had that money that the other members of the caravan had given them. So other members of the caravan of these farming families thought there must be some type of truth to the story that these men were telling them. So the caravan packed up about a dozen or so of the men that were part of the group, some of them clad with guns, and they went back to the town of Urkhammer to investigate, and they too noticed that the town itself seemed not there, but rather just ghostly silhouettes of these buildings that looked like they were there, but they weren't. And they returned to camp, and rightfully so, realizing that this was kind of a literal ghost town. They packed up all their belongings and quickly made for the hills, and for that, I don't really blame them. Now, hearing this story, the Iowa State Police decided they wanted to investigate the growing reports of the town that kind of seems to be fading from reality. And according to how the legend of Urkhammer, Iowa goes, when a deputy from the Iowa State Police went to the town to question some townsfolk who lived there, he was also met with his hand passing straight through a house door when he attempted to knock on it. After this, it seems the legend of Urkhammer continues, that the town continued to kind of fade from reality until nothing remained. People who drove by the former town of Urkhammer no longer saw children playing in the yards of homes. They started to slowly see livestock. They couldn't be seen anymore on farms until, again, pretty much the only thing left in the town of Urkhammer, Iowa, was just these endless, untended fields of emptiness. However, the stories of Urkhammer would not be real, unfortunately, and the origin of Urkhammer would also date back to around 2015, when an internet writer named Cullen Hudson wrote on a website that he ran called Strange State. Hudson would tell this story that his mother found, the story of Urkhammer, Iowa, when she was cleaning out her email inbox, and his mother, Hudson's mother, knew that he had an interest in these type of, strange stories and oddities and things like that, and basically said, hey, Cullen, here is this story of this weird town, and here you go. You like this kind of stuff. Here you go. And then because of that, Hudson published the story on Strange State I guess that's from him saying this. So the internet then took it. Once Cullen Hudson put it on Strange State, the internet took it, continued to spread the legend of Urkhammer, Iowa, tell the stories, and eventually it made it onto all these other sites around the internet. However, of course, it does make me ask the question that if Hudson did not create this story himself, which I think he did, who did create the story if Hudson didn't create it? Now, it sounds very clearly to me that this sounds like a plot to a good science fiction book, and it actually might be. Now that I'm thinking about that, it might actually be the plot to a science fiction book, but don't quote me on that. I don't read a lot of science fiction novels. But it kind of brings me back to how I started the episode, and that being the question of why do we as humans continue to find intrigue and fascination with towns and cities that seemingly vanish off the face of the earth, regardless if they are real or fake? Of course, everyone loves a good urban legend and story, but what these stories of Urkhammer, Iowa, and Doveland, Wisconsin have in common is that these aren't the first stories of ghost towns, or towns that have seemingly vanished from public view or have become complete ghost towns, with no explanation as to why that's the case. Perhaps the most mystifying case of a vanishing town or city, in my opinion, is one that originates in 1585. Now, of course, I won't go too in-depth into this story, as I can do a whole episode on it, and I probably will at some point along a later date. And this town being the lost colony of Roanoke. Now, anybody who knows early American history has probably heard of that, the lost colony of Roanoke in some capacity. You just don't know a lot of very specific details about it. As the story roughly goes with the lost colony of Roanoke, a group of settlers to the New World and in what is now modern-day North Carolina established this colony called the Roanoke Colony. And this was an attempt by Sir Walter Raleigh to create the first established colony in North America. The colony was originally established, from what I could find, in 1585, and then later on in 1587, 117 men, women, and children would arrive at the colony and, of course, make it their new home. However, 3 weeks later, when the next ship from England would arrive, all of the men, women, and children would be gone. They all vanished without a trace. Now, this is a mystery that has endured for over 400 years, and this is a very real story. Unlike Urkhammer and Doveland, this is a very real story, and us as human beings are no closer to finding out what actually happened to these 117 individuals from the lost colony of Roanoke, because it looks like they had just disappeared off the face of the planet. Now, stories of Roanoke and other cities such as Machu Picchu, for example, fascinate the human imagination and inspire to create stories about places and events that we have no insight into. And although Doveland and Urkhammer might not be real places, Of course, they pique human curiosity and make us wonder what other discoveries have yet to be made in the world of vanishing locations and even, people disappearing without a trace. Now, at this point of the episode, I would normally go into kind of thoughts and theories. But of course, there aren't really any theories when it comes to this, as both of these stories just happen to be made up. But that doesn't mean that there isn't stories out there of other towns, much like Urkhammer and Doveland, that actually have some real stories behind them. Now, take the example of Portlock, Alaska, for example, which is a very real case of a ghost town, with a very haunting story about a Bigfoot-like creature that dismembered sheep hunters in the 1940s, as well as rampant ghost sightings in the town, and most notably around the nearby Chatham Bay region. Now, the hauntings and unexplained happenings in the town of Portlock, Alaska became so frequent, most of the town's residents actually had moved out by 1949, and finally the postmaster would move out in 1951, officially making Portlock, Alaska a ghost town. Now, whether or not you believe that there is a monster in Portlock, Alaska, or ghosts or anything like that, it does make stories such as military accidents in Doveland, Wisconsin, and Urkhammer, Iowa, seeming to fade out of existence and out of reality itself. It makes those stories seem much more believable. Of course, if you can believe a giant savage beast tearing sheep hunters limb from limb, you can probably believe that the U.S. government did something that they probably shouldn't have in this obscure Wisconsin town, or maybe even a town in Iowa seeming to transcend dimensions. Who knows? Even though they're fake, they're very fun to talk about. And I know that this was a little bit different of an episode for me, and because of that, I did hope that you enjoyed the little change of pace for this week's episode. Again, it is unfortunate that the towns of Doveland, Wisconsin, and Urkhammer, Iowa don't exist, but again, it casts a broader net out there in terms of human fascination, of course, with towns that no longer exist, with people who seem to disappear out of the blue, and even planes disappearing out of the blue. Again, I mean, look at MH370, we still have no answers for that, and that plane full of, hundreds of passengers disappeared off the face of the earth, and we still have no answers. So it's almost like the fake stories help us be more aware of the actual real ones, and it's often funny how that works. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. And I know it was a little bit different pace, and I know that there was no suspense in terms of us talking about theories, but I wanted to take a little bit of a 180 this week and do something a little bit different and kind of go over, again, some urban legends, some kind of internet tall tales about towns that used to exist but now shockingly don't. But again, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode on Doveland and Urkhammer, the towns that never existed. And with that being said, I will see you all on the next one.